Welcome to the Rethink and Return podcast. I'm Nils Smith, joined by Jason Shepperd. Jason, I am so excited about today's topic. We are digging into developing a house church pastor. Jason, just even as a refresher, can you share with our listeners what is a house church to you? How did you articulate what a house church is, and why is a house church pastor so important to the development of house churches?
Well, hey, Nils, how you doing? Good to see you. Glad to have this conversation with you always. Thanks for priming these questions in this conversation. And yeah, a house church, I grew up not knowing what a house church was. I grew up in a very traditional model church. The first time I heard about house church, I thought it was people who, made their own dresses and churned their own butter. It was just like, people of the corn kind of stuff. Like it was people who were like, whether they're special Christians or they're getting away from the non-special Christians or the not real Christians. So I didn't know what it was. It wasn't a part of my life. I wasn't pursuing it. But as I continued to develop my ecclesiology, my study of the church biblically, globally, and historically, I started seeing this idea of house church. You can't not see it in Scripture. And so either it was just, a janky, weak way to start until they could become a real church with a real building and real offices and real staff, or there was really something to it. And so I started studying Scripture. I became an ecclesiology sort of nerd. It just became what drove me a lot because it was the context of the church, the doctrine of the church. And I saw house churches all over, to the church that meets in so-and-so's house. And then we would see that those house churches would multiply, and there'd be one church in a city made up of many house churches. And of course, now we got way into a lot of denominations, a lot of different things, but the original construct of the church that we can find in Scripture, second century, and throughout history and around the world was one church made up of many house churches. So we have this idea of a church of house churches. A house church can multiply into many house churches, but they're moving together as one in a city. They're overseen by a common body of elders, and they're one church connected through many house churches.
And so, Jason, I come from a Baptist background and world, and for a Baptist church to basically get a pastor, they've got to form a pastor search committee. They've got to then go through a massive process, and the pastors had to go to seminary and had to have, basically Jesus wouldn't qualify for most Baptist churches today to pastor their churches. How do you, within your congregation, then identify, without a search committee and without, all of that, who a good house church pastor would be?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what you're saying is what used to happen in the Old Testament. There, you could actually had to be born into certain families to be a certain type of priest. And so, Jesus sort of blew that up. I mean, when we see the first century, the new church that Jesus began, he changed some things. He said, wherever you gather, I'll be with you. He was demolishing the idea of sacred space. He wasn't saying it's bad to gather. He wasn't saying that you can only gather with 2 or 3 people. He was saying wherever you gather, you didn't have to gather in a temple or a synagogue. And then the Apostle Paul called it the priesthood of believers, which for us seems normal, but for them, especially first century, it would have blown their mind. You're calling me a royal priesthood? I'm a priest? There's no way I'm a priest. And then what we see happen, several centuries into the church, we see the clergification of the church, or the re-clergification of the church, back to the Old Testament stuff, where we have sacred places and sacred people, sacred pastors, sacred priests. So the sacred pastors have replaced the sacred priests. And what we've really done is we have removed the priesthood of the believers. So pastoring is an office, and it's also a function. It's this idea of the shepherd or overseer of a community. And so we have different words interchangeably used in the Bible for this. We have overseer, elder, bishop, and pastor that are being used for the same function, if you will, but different offices in the church. And so we see people pastoring and shepherding and eldering and overseeing over other people. We have those qualifications listed clearly in Timothy and Titus, that deacons, elders, overseers should all qualify. We say we're looking for these qualifications and also these biblical qualities of a pastor, but we're not looking for the clergification of the church. We need to ask the question, where did this come from? Our expectation of and our idea of a pastor in this way, where did it come from? And you're right. If we went back to the way that the apostles themselves were chosen, which would have had authority over elders and overseers and bishops back then,
Mm-hmm.
they wouldn't have qualified for what we're really looking for the office of a pastor. So the idea of an elevated and separated and venerated pastor, we can't celebrate that through New Testament ecclesiology. We just can't do it. The idea of finding somebody within the body and they meet the qualifications and the qualities of a pastor, and we put them in that position where they are accountable for to shepherd people. We do see that in Scripture all day long. And so what we're doing as a church of house churches is we're taking a group or a class, we're making it a church, and we're taking a leader or a teacher, and we're making this person a pastor. And they're accountable for shepherding and overseeing this small body of believers under the authority of common elders.
That's good. And so practically, do you just, and I say, does your team go and kind of handpick, like, I think you would be a good house church pastor? Do people apply to be a house church pastor? What is that practical process to becoming a house church pastor?
We meet with a lot of pastors, a lot of church leaders who are, starting a church or transitioning to a church, and we tell them your first two are the most important. When we started Church Friday, we had 40 people. We put these people on 2 house churches. We had 2 guys who were house church pastors. One was Rob, one was Randy. One met on the west side of I-45, one on the east side of I-45. We essentially said, hey, if you live on this side, go to this house church. On this side, go to this house church. I chose those guys sort of like the Apostle Paul would have chosen somebody. Sometimes he went to a place for a night, and then he left and elevated some people. I chose them based upon how I got to know them over the course of about a month. I saw they had all the qualifications and the qualities as much as I could discern. I raised them up, but then I kept meeting with them, discipling them, teaching them, getting us to this idea of a house church that none of us had ever practiced before. They had led classes or groups, but this. But then you find your existing house church, your future house church pastors from within an existing house church. Mm-hmm. How do we know somebody? Paul tells Timothy, you know all about my life. Like we get to know somebody's life because they're living in a house church. I don't want somebody to be a house church pastor if they're not at somebody else's house church every week. I want to watch their life. I want to see how they care for people. When they speak, do people listen? Mm-hmm. We get to hear their doctrine when they respond to something we're wrestling with in Scripture. How do they correct somebody or help somebody or step in when somebody's in need? So we really are easily able to identify a future house church pastor from within an existing house church. We highly recommend to people, don't look for house church pastors from without house churches, outside of house churches, because you can't prove them. And you don't know them, and you can't transfer DNA with them. So we say a house church begats a house church pastor begats a house church. That's Leviticus, Numbers language, so-and-so begats so-and-so. Like this is the way that we propagate the world with house churches from within an existing house church. Once we identify that somebody likely is a candidate to that, we have a process here. We put them in an incubator. We work on their acute doctrine. We make sure we have a lot of alignment. They understand the expectations. And then we form a core group with them from within that house church to send them out. So that's our quick process there.
Yeah, that's so good. That obviously is very biblical. It sounds like, too, if your first name starts with an R, you're ahead of the game with Rob and Randy, I think is those names. It's and just to be clear, that's not actually an important note. That's just something I picked up on. And your first 2 house churches, but it makes sense. Right. If you're starting a church,
it helped with alliteration. Randy to the right.
Yeah. With the Rethink and Return, Rob and Randy, the R's are working here.
That's right.
I do think practically it you don't need to start with, and I think a lot of churches, they want to start with 50, and they want to start big, but you start with 2. And now, Jason, how many house churches does Church Project have today?
Well, we in this location now we have around 70, but we're, raising up house churches and sending them out, cutting them off, and starting a new church project. So 70 this location, we just, started another church project down the road. They have, I don't know how many right now, 8, 10, 15. Up the road in North County, there's 15 or 20 house churches, and they started out of here. And so, we're constantly looking to start house churches in other parts of our area. So when we get a group of people, a group of house churches that are driving from a distance, we'll sort of cut them off and help them start a new house church. So There are hundreds of
Love
house
that.
churches connected to church projects all around. But right here in the Woodlands right now, in this one local church, right, we have around 70 or so, but I think there's 15 or 20 in an incubator right now. We think there'll be around 100 by the end of the year. Who knows?
Yeah. That's awesome. That's awesome. And I think that multiplication from within is so key to that. You mentioned you have an incubator. What does that look like when it comes to training those new house church pastors?
Yeah, well, if we're going to, we are truly distributed leadership. We are decentralized from primary priest and primary place. And so we've got to really trust them. We have ways that we're coaching our house church pastors, caring for them, checking on them. We're doing that for sure. We continue to meet together with them often, but we need to make sure before we send them out that we have a lot of alignment. So we pull them and their spouse out of their existing house church for a month. We bring them together with other future house church pastors, and we walk with them through what is this idea of a house church pastor. What is your role? What are the expectations? And then we talk about acute ideas of doctrine. How do you handle difficult situations pastoring? Here are the expectations, how we submit to the elders here and work together as one. We go through all those things together and make sure we're all in alignment. And after that incubator, if we still feel like somebody is not quite there, then we'll delay our deployment of them. But generally, somebody's been in a house church a very long time, 6 months, a year, before they become, get into the incubator. And we've seen their life. We know their doctrine. They've already been sharing in the pastoring of a house church.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And then practically within that incubation process and that training process, and I think it's the beauty of every church being a little unique. And I would assume that many of those leaders came out of different backgrounds and different
Yeah.
faith backgrounds. How do you ensure that you infuse the DNA of Church Project into those house churches?
That's an intuitive question, Nils. And that's what we really love here. People are coming from all different types of backgrounds, and that's what we want, I think. Most churches are fairly monolithic theologically on the edges of doctrine. Of course, people come here because, they believe in the centrality and supremacy of Scripture, the gospel. This is what we're doing. But there may be things that they haven't understood the same on tertiary issues doctrinally. And so where are we giving freedom here? Where does our church stand? But you can not align, but you will express the stance of our church. And what are the non-negotiables? And so we have those written out for us, and we know what those lines are for us. And so we really like that people are coming here. They're going to hear a doctrinally sound sermon every Sunday when all of our house churches gather together. They're going to be sitting in a house church and hearing this. So if somebody really is not aligned with us, we've had enough time and they've had enough time to know we're not aligned. We're going to check that alignment, generally and acutely in the incubator. But we've all had enough time with each other to know whether or not we're aligned. And a lot of people are coming here from their different places, and they've held on to secondary, tertiary, supplemental issues as primary doctrine. And they come here and they're like, I'm letting that go. And I've let go of primary doctrine, and I focus on secondary, tertiary, supplemental doctrine, and I need to put that back in order. And now, actually, those things aren't my primary things anymore. And I'm really glad I'm in a place that is teaching the word so robustly, sharing the gospel so passionately. And so, time with each other is really the helpful thing here.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You've talked about basically kind of multiplying house churches, and essentially it can probably feel almost like a church split when that happens. How do you avoid? Naturally, then those house churches are, as that new house church pastor is kind of then launched out, and and then obviously some people go with them, and based on different circumstances, how do you avoid perceptions of a church split, and how do you kind of even celebrate that so it doesn't hurt the existing house church that the new house church is being birthed out of?
Yeah, great question. Well, one, we do celebrate it, and then we do it caringly. The great thing is when it's time to reproduce as a house church, everybody's feeling that. there's too many people here. A house church pastor can't care for people. They're not being pastored well if the house church is too big. People aren't engaging with each other if the house church is too big. This is our small space. And if it gets too big into a medium-sized space, all the dynamics of a pastor being able to pastor a group of people this size, of people being able to share and wrestle through the word together and pray for each other, we lose that dynamic and the house church will atrophy. And so it's counterproductive to get too big for a house church. People often ask, what's the perfect size for a house church? And I say medium. Medium is the perfect size for a house church. We know when it's too small, but we also can feel when it's too big. And so some people are like, well, would it be 3 because that's the Trinity and 3 days in the whale and 3 days in the grave? Would it be 7 because that's the perfect number? Would it be 12 because of the disciples? Or would it be 11, some people say, because you had Judas and we don't want him, or would it be 40, right? And so like, what number do we choose? Which is the right one? And so for me, I'm like, let's just get to medium. When it's too big, we know it. When it's too small, that feels awkward too. So we don't want to start a house church that's too small, and that's going to struggle. And we don't want to keep one too big where people are suffering and not being pastored well. And so really people are already feeling it, number one, but two, it's our mission. I mean, we celebrate it. And, sometimes jokingly, but I think it's a good analogy. I tell people, I mean, we're going to send our kids off to college. Sadly, I mean, if it's a great relationship, it should be sad. We're going to miss them. But if we don't send them off to college, they're going to be living in our basement in the 30s. And that's not good either. So the options here are, I'm going to miss you, but I'm going to send you off, or you're going to stay and it's going to be really unhealthy. I mean, those are really the only two options. The third option that we don't allow, that most people do, most churches do, is a closed off option. Like, this house church is closed. People can't come here. But then you totally miss mission. And can you imagine in the early church? I mean, can you imagine somebody stumbled into their gathering of thousands of people together? It's Solomon's colonnade next to the temple courts after they got kicked out. They're listening to the apostles' teaching, and then they go to the house church closest to where they live in their quadrant of the city, and they walk into a house church. They're seeking Jesus, and they're a new believer and want to be discipled, be in community, and they're like, I'm sorry, this house church is closed. I mean, it just seems antithetical to all of Scripture to close something. And so for us, no house church is ever closed. Man, go to the house church closest to you. When it gets too big, we'll multiply. We celebrate that because that's the mission. The mission of house church is house church. We want everybody in our community at a house church. So we need more house churches that are healthy for that to happen.
Love that. Love that. That's a really interesting model of they're never closed. And Jason, let's I want to close with this question of, with your house church pastors, and naturally they're going to need being cared for. And there's times where maybe they're going to need to even step out of that leadership role due to a life circumstance or whatever that situation is how do you effectively care for your house church pastors, and how do you shepherd those shepherds?
Great question. And by the way, you always ask great, insightful questions and guide the conversation. Awesome. Thank you. And I would get lost if I wasn't being guided.
Absolutely.
That'd be everyone. I say, Nils, every pastor needs a pastor. Every pastor needs a pastor. And so when we started Church Project, I pastored every house church pastor. I mean, I was with them together as a group once a month, and I was with each of them individually once a month. And so I may go have lunch with Eric, and I'm going to talk to him about, tell me about your life, your marriage, your kids, your finances, your health, your job. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about how Jesus is affecting every area of your life. When Jesus said, make disciples, teach them to obey everything I commanded you. Hey, how are we following Jesus in every area of our life? Every house church pastor is trying to make sure that that's happening in their house church with everybody. Who's doing that for them? And a lot of churches miss over that. And so we do this now. I'll tell you how we do it differently now, but I would ask them that question. Let's talk about you. Let's care for you. So I would know when somebody was losing their job and how they were doing, and, if their marriage was struggling, or if their kid was, rebelling, or if they were sick or their parent died, and I would care for them. But then we got too many, so we had to scale that. We have a beautiful system now, but we'll ask them 3 questions, monthly or bi-monthly now. I mean, twice a month. We talk about you, Jesus, in every area of your life. Secondly, we talk about the health of your house church. Is your house church effectively fulfilling its intentions? Like, are we fellowshipping together? Are we in community together? Is the only time y'all ever talk when you show up for house church once a week? Or do you ever do anything? Are people having, dinners together, watching each other's kids? Anybody going on vacation together? What's community like in your house church? What's the conversation around the word like? Are you teaching, or are you leading people to wrestle with the word? Are you lecturing people, or do people have an opportunity here, which they don't anywhere else, to question and wonder and wrestle with these things aloud in a safe community of people who are doctrinally sound and can help them get on track? And so, are y'all praying together? Are we spending long, unhurried time in prayer together? Are we having 70 prayer gatherings across our city right now? So what's the health of you? What's the health of your house church? And then, hey, who are you looking to host? Like, who here has the gift of hospitality that is crazy enough and godly enough to want people to come into their home, on a regular basis? Like, who has the gift of hospitality? I define hospitality as you want people in your home and people want to be in your home. And so who are our hosts? It's a great gift that we overlook in the church. It's crucial, even in the early church, for the church to spread and exist. It's crucial for us here. We have no house churches without houses. We have no houses without people saying, I have the gift of hospitality. I want you to be in my house. Secondly, who is the house church pastor that you're looking to raise up? Is this person spiritually mature? Are they growing? Are they engaged? And so we're having this conversation with the house church pastor often. Because of that, we're always aware of where they are. We know if they're tired, we know if they're struggling, and we can sort of see down the road a little bit and go, hey, we might have some concerns coming up a couple of months from now. Every once in a while, we have an emergency. Somebody had to move last minute. Somebody got sick and they're out for a long time. Those things are rare, though. Generally, if we know the house church pastor well enough, we see these things well before they happen, and we can start making changes. But that's the beauty of having a house church. Quick anecdote here. A guy came to our church one time. I tell this story because it applies. I tell it sometimes because it works. This guy came to our church and like, hey, how'd you find us? What are you doing here? And he's like, well, I used to be a part of a house church. I'm like, great. Why aren't you there now? And he said, well, my house church pastor got sick. They had to close up their restaurant, move to another town, and we don't have a house church anymore. And I'm like, well, I'm sorry you got sick. I'm sorry you lost your house church. I'm like, let me tell you how that would have happened here. We would have figured out a way to care for that guy, help keep his restaurant open if we could, supplement his salary if we could, get him to the best doctors. But we would have helped raise up the next house church pastor. You would have been under the beauty of overseers and elders, and we have other mechanisms to support house churches here. So an isolated house church without the connectivity to other house churches is also very dangerous. And some people left, I don't like this authoritarian church, so I'm going to go over here. And you really have the same thing, just on a very small scale of an authoritarian, isolated individual and fairly impotent house church.
Yeah, it's boy, that the health side of, and I feel like that could almost be a whole podcast series in and of itself, is healthy house churches.
That's right.
And really monitoring that. But healthy house churches are going to be led by healthy house church pastors.
That's right.
And I think that infrastructure is so key. And I think this is actually a good transition. In our next episode, we're going to be shifting to basically a church of house churches beyond the house church. And so we're going to dig into the large corporate gatherings next episode. But I think that this is a good just closing aspect of this focus that we've had in these last few episodes around the house church pastors. But I think that healthy house churches are led by healthy house church pastors. And I think your structure and focus on that is so clear. One of the things I love, Jason, is how you have built over time very, very systematic approaches to how you're leading and growing and allowing these house churches to multiply. And so I love that structure. Any closing thoughts before we wrap up this episode?
Well, I was thinking as you were summarizing that so well, leadership is dynamic. The principles remain the same, but the application of those principles has to adjust based on size or strength and weakness of certain seasons. So, for example, the principle was from early on, every house church pastor needs a pastor. I need a pastor. I have pastors that are over me and pour into my life, but every house church pastor needs a pastor too. That principle hasn't changed. How we do that now has changed. We have 6 or 7 people who pastor our house church pastors, and that's their job. Some are part-time, a couple are full-time, and they just pastor house church pastors. And all the people they affect downstream is a lot, hundreds and hundreds, through each of these coaches. So the principles need to be there from the very beginning. How you apply those principles is dynamic. That leadership is crucial, that you're willing to change. So no, Nils, I think we're all, rightly so, as church leaders, wanting to lead churches in a very healthy, sustainable way. And so that's why I feel like we distribute pastoral leadership. It's not all on the clergy. It's surely not all on me. We distribute pastoral leadership, and we pastor the people that we've entrusted to lead. So that's a beautiful principle to live by. And if we do that, I think we'll have healthier people like me lead people in churches. We'll have healthier house church pastors. We'll have healthier churches.
So good. So good. Thank you for sharing that, Jason. And I want to encourage everyone that's listening that if this podcast was meaningful to you, and as Jason shared in the intro of this podcast, share this podcast with a friend and think of somebody who you believe in another leader that could gain value from this podcast. We want this conversation to be integrated into more ministry conversations with other ministry leaders. Also, if you haven't yet gotten on our email list, make sure you go to rethinkandreturnpodcast.com and get on our email list, where we're going to share updates of all of our new episodes coming out and other resources we know that you'll want to hear about and learn about and be the first to know. So go to rethinkandreturnpodcast.com to get on that email list, and we'll talk to you again on the next episode.
See you guys. Thanks, Nils.